Alrighty, as we have been travelling our way through the book, or the letter I should say, to the Romans, we've come to the interesting bit which nobody reads in the middle. But that's a pity because it's really leading up to what this whole letter is really about, which is how God has had a plan through the Jewish people to save the world and all the nations. So anyway, as we get started today, this was an interesting passage where, if you remember our Old Testament reading, where God says that he's pretty much had it with the worship of the Jews and saying, you know, you've got all these festivals and Sabbath day celebrations and yet you're not mixing it with faith. It's not really doing the thing it's actually designed to do. And so it becomes pointless. And it reminds me of a test I had to take when I was at school. I remember you probably have taken this test at some point. I don't know if anyone here has. It's a test where you get a piece of paper. It was right at the first day of high school, actually. This has happened to me. And they sat down and said, we just want to do a test with every member of the class. And they give you this piece of paper. And the first instruction says, please read all the instructions on this paper before attempting to answer any of the questions. And then it says, place your name at the top right hand of the paper. And then the first question is, why is the sky blue? And of course, the answer is because of the way that ozone absorbs light. And so, you know, I wrote that down on my thing. Pretty clever, I knew that even back then when I was 13 years of age. And then what is the sum of 1,235 plus 645 then times by 537? Anyone got that just quickly? Yeah, I didn't get that one. And then can penguins sing? You know, I'm not really sure, but I think they can. So yes is the answer there. And then it said, stand on one leg with your eyes closed and stay balanced for 10 seconds. And so that's actually really difficult. Have you ever tried that? Stand on one leg with your eyes closed and then be able to balance for 10 seconds. It sounds like it's easy. It's not. So, you know, I got up and I fell over a few times. I think I eventually got it. Several of the other class members couldn't get that, so I thought I was doing pretty good. And so it would go until we got to the end of the paper. And then it says, once you have read this entire paper, please ignore all the problems apart from writing your name at the top right hand of the corner and place at the tray at the front. Now, there was only about two of the students in the class who did that because they read the first instruction, which do not attempt to answer any of these questions until you've answered them all. Has anyone done that test? Yeah. And I reckon the two people who got that right on the day had done that test before. And that was the only reason they got it. Not you? Okay, well done. You know how to take instructions. You're a person of detail. Well, so there's one amongst us. I'm not a details guy, in case you haven't noticed. And so, yeah, I fell for it. I made the classic mistake. I completely didn't see what this whole test... The test was really to see whether you could take instructions or not. And something like that is true in the problem that Paul is dealing with spiritually for his countrymen, the Jews. He's saying the Jews, they know it all and they seem like they're doing the right thing, but they're not mixing it with faith. So the whole thing's falling over. And that's why he writes what he writes in the end of chapter 9, going into chapter 10. And he uses this word righteousness. He talks about righteousness. Now, I've got to admit, whenever the word righteousness gets trundled out, I think a lot of people just go, ugh. Because it's kind of a very religious sounding word, you know, righteousness. But it's actually quite a simple word. At its simplest and most basic meaning, it just simply means being or doing what is right. That takes the mystery out of it a bit, doesn't it? A person who is righteous is a person who does what is right. But what seems right isn't always the way it actually seems. Just like that test, it seemed right that I answered the questions and that I stood up and stood for 10 seconds with my eyes closed. Turns out everything I was doing was wrong, even though it seemed like it was right. And this is what the writer Isaiah is saying to the people of Israel. He's saying, you are doing what seems right. Turns out what you think is right actually isn't, because there's no faith there. And Paul is wanting to say something like that to the Jewish Christians and also to the Gentile Christians. He says that what really matters in the end, righteousness, is submitting to what God wants, not doing what you think God wants, or doing what your instincts tell you to do. And, just like that test paper, whenever we think of righteousness, we tend to think, well, the right thing to do is going to be keeping some kind of moral code, doing our religious duty, being a nice person, and then we think we're answering all the questions correctly. And look, don't get me wrong, all those things are actually good in their right place, but they're not the primary thing. The primary thing, just like on that paper, the primary thing was to read all the instructions on the paper first. Otherwise I'll get everything wrong. And so, and there's nothing worse than when you think you're doing the right thing and it turns out that everything you're doing is wrong and is heading in the other direction. And that's why Paul then writes, what then shall we say in verse 30 of chapter 9? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith. In other words, he's saying, so here's the Gentiles, they're the Jackie-come-latelys, they've just turned up, and suddenly they're doing exactly what God requires, which is to trust him, to give their allegiance to him, and to believe him. And so even though they're, last in line, somehow or another, they've obtained righteousness. In other words, they have done the right thing, even though they've come from their pagan background. The thing that they've done right is say, oh, well, I'm just going to trust God. So that was what was right. But then he goes on in verse 31 and says, but the people of Israel who pursued the law as a way of righteousness have not obtained their goal, because they're answering all the questions on the paper without really understanding the top line. And the top line is, trust me, believe in me. And why not? Because they pursued it, not by faith, but as if it were by works. So they're not trusting in God, they're trusting in themselves. And consequently, they're stumbling over the stumbling stone. As it is written, see, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. But the one who believes in me will never be put to shame. In other words, if you're actually trusting in God, you'll never be put to shame. But if you're trusting in yourself, no matter how good and how well you keep the law, you're going to be sent sprawling. As the Message translation has it, Israel, who seemed so interested in reading and talking about what God was doing, missed it. And how could they miss it? Because instead of trusting God, they took over. They were absorbed in what they themselves were doing. They were so absorbed in their God projects that they didn't notice God right there in front of them, like a huge rock in the middle of the road, and so they stumbled into him and went sprawling. I mean, it's a little bit like the guy says to his wife, I worship the ground you walk on. And they says, so if you could just get out of the way, I could get on with worshipping that ground. And that's what Paul is saying about the Israelites. He's saying that they're virtually saying to God, I worship the ground you walk on. Because look at all the things I'm doing, all our God projects, all the laws we're keeping, all the festivals we're keeping. And then God says, but you're not doing the right thing. Your instincts tell you that's right, but it's not the essential right. Those things are good, don't get me wrong. But there's the horse has got to come before the cart, and the first thing that has to happen is trust and belief. And of course, here are these Gentiles. They turn up late in the day, and they just simply trust God, and they're finding, and that's the right thing. Meanwhile, the people who seem to know it all miss out. So that's why Paul goes on in the next chapter to say, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer is to God for the Israelites, that they might be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Just like in that test, I zealously went to pursue answer all those questions, but it wasn't based on the truth. And since, verse 3, he says, since they did not know the righteousness of God, they sought to establish their own, that is their own righteousness. They did not submit to God's righteousness. But Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. So here's the thing, in that passage, the three kinds of righteousness are talked about. There is, first of all, the righteousness of God. What's the righteousness of God? That is the being of God and the right things that God does. This is where a huge misunderstanding in Reformed churches is that they have understood the righteousness of God to be a righteousness from God. But it's actually talking about who God is and the right things that God does, not the righteousness from God. Anyway, so God is doing what he's doing, and there's a right way to respond to that. And that is what the second kind of righteousness is the right way to respond to God, which is to believe, to have faith. But there's another kind of righteousness, which is self-righteousness, which is, I will do these things and then God will bless me and love me. But the righteousness of God is, according to Paul, a display of God's faithfulness to the covenant promises that he made to his people. In the old covenant, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations and that through him all the nations on earth would be blessed, and the fulfillment of that would come through a great king, a Messiah. So the fulfillment, the ultimate plan, is for a Messiah to come. And of course, Jesus is that Messiah. He comes and he fulfills the law, as it says that he's the culmination of the law in this translation. Most of you, if you're familiar with that passage, would know it from other translations, which says that Christ is the end of the law. And that's, again, misunderstood as if Christ is cancelling out the law. He's not cancelling it out. He's bringing it to its conclusion. He's brought everything that the law, and the law, by the way, isn't just a list, isn't just a moral code. The law is all of the first five books of the Bible, which includes the promise to Abraham that all the nations on earth would be blessed. And how would they be blessed? Through Israel, a great king would come and be the hope of the world, and he would set up a kingdom which would be the hope of all the kingdoms on earth. That's how it would be fulfilled. And that's where the law was pointing. And meanwhile, the Jews seem to know all about the Messiah, and then the Messiah comes, he's standing in front of them, and they can't even see him. And of course, when the Holy Spirit came on the day of Pentecost, that was when the promise that was made to Abraham overflowed out of Israel and into the nations, and then all of a sudden the Gentile nations began to gather, and they believed. They joined the family of Abraham, and meanwhile the people who had the blood of Abraham flowing in their veins were missing out, oddly enough. Even though they were insiders, they missed out because they didn't have the faith of Abraham. Instead, they were just trusting in their bloodline and in their law keeping. And so Paul rebukes the Jews for this attitude, reminding them that Abraham himself and his descendants are also included by faith, and faith is the right way to respond to God. That is the right way. And of course, that reminds me of the Matthew 22, which is actually about this very thing. Jesus told this parable about a certain king who was going to have his son married, and so he made preparations for the wedding. And back in those days, with no refrigeration, everything had to be timed perfectly. You had to get the meat and the salads and whatever else, and the Diet Coke just at the right temperature at the right time. Yeah, oh, does it? Okay. You get a better reaction when it's warm. Doesn't taste so good though. Anyway, he's telling this story to say, so the great king is making preparations. Everyone would have, of course, known about the preparations. I mean, everyone knew what the king was doing. And then he sent out an invitation to all of his friends and relatives, the people who are meant to come. And the servants go out, and of course, in that story, the servants get abused. They get told to get off the property. In some cases, they're even murdered. And the king is absolutely furious when he hears about this. And so he says to his servants, well, if they won't come, I'm not going to waste this banquet. Go out and find the aliens, the crippled on the streets, the poor in the slums, bring everyone in. I'm not going to have this banquet going to waste. So they go out and they gather all the people up and bring them in. And then the king comes to the servants, and the servants say, we've done as you said. We've gone out onto the streets and we've gathered the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall is filled with guests. Now that's a very interesting little passage there, that he filled the hall with the bad and the good. In other words, there was no discrimination. It was for anyone and everyone. And if we understand the context in which this is written, he's really saying that it's going to be made up of people from Jewish blood and people from Gentile blood are going to be gathered at the table. And there's some people who should have been there who aren't there. Some of the Jewish people missed out because they simply were too caught up in what they were doing. But both good people and bad people are brought to the table. And then while the banquet is underway and all these people are gathered there, the king is actually wandering around amongst the guests, and he comes across a certain man who is not dressed in wedding clothes. And he says to him, "How did you get in here without wedding clothes?" And the man is mute, he says nothing. And then the king says to his servants, "Take this man, bind him hand and foot and throw him outside." And what a strange story, I thought, what is going on there? And then, you've probably heard me talk about this before, but I became aware through my contact with other people in Asia that this is still practiced to this day, that if you go to a royal wedding, say in Bhutan or somewhere like that, you come and you take off your clothes, you put on the clothes that the king supplies, because your clothing becomes part of the decorations. So there's a colour theme, for instance. Everyone might be dressed in blue or green, or blue and green, whatever, and with special insignia on the clothes. And for you to refuse to dress in the clothes that the king supplies is an affront, and it is a really serious social faux pas. And this is exactly what's going on in this story. And what we take away from that is that doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, whether you're a good person or a bad person, Jewish or Gentile, slave or free, as I've said last week, doesn't matter who you are, you must submit to God the same way. Jewish people have to put their trust in God. Gentile people have to put their trust in God and come and approach him in faith. Now, here's the thing. We're about to actually do that right now. We're going to take communion. And as I've said many, many times, when you come to the communion table, this is not where you come to present something to God. To say, look at me, what a good boy I am, I've done these good things, and therefore I have a right to approach the table. Or another person says, I don't have a right to approach the table, I've been a pretty crummy person the last month, so I don't think I should take communion. But the good and the bad come through the same door. And if you've got rags on, you're meant to take those rags off and then submit to the clothing that the king supplies. Or if you've got really nice clothes, you've got to take the nice clothes off and submit to the clothing that the king supplies. And so that applies to the Jews and the Gentiles. The Gentiles have to take off their Jewish confidence that I'm right because I'm Jewish and put that aside and just trust in God. That's the right thing to do. And the Gentile person who's got no record of keeping law or doing what's right have to take off their unrighteousness and submit to the righteousness from God, or the righteousness of God, to make them right, to declare them right. And so it doesn't matter. Either way, the right thing to do, the true form of righteousness, is to submit to what God is doing for you, to let God love you. And that's what we do at communion. At communion, we come saying, I am a needy person, and it doesn't matter whether I'm well-dressed or bad, I'm going to lay aside my garments and I'm going to put on Christ. And by faith, you put on Christ. You take on the life and the being of Christ in a sacramental way by taking his body and his blood. And that's what the meaning of that is. It's a sacrament of his body and his blood, his being and his fulfilling of the law. So Christ is the end of the law. He has brought the law to its goal. And then when you put on Christ, you are included in his connection to God, and you get to sit at the table at the wedding banquet, so to speak. This is a practice run for the wedding banquet. There's going to be a lot more interesting food and better wine on the day. Anyway, but nonetheless, by faith, that's what we're doing. Does that make sense? So let's do that now as we come to communion. Lay aside, you might think, oh, I'm such a bad person. Lay aside that. Lay aside your shame and put on Christ. Or you might think, oh no, I think I'm doing pretty good. No. Lay aside your pride, put on Christ. Either way, Jesus is the only door. Amen.